clay tablet is sitting in a kiln in the city of Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, somewhere around 1200 BC. It has just been written and set to fire so it can be dispatched. It is a letter from the king, and it says that enemy ships have appeared off the coast, that his fleet is away in Lycian waters, that his army is away in Hittite territory, and that his cities are already burning. The tablet was still in the oven when the city fell. It was never sent. Ugarit was never rebuilt, and nothing was ever built on top of it. That is a real object. But the thing that killed Ugarit was not the ships in the harbour that morning. It was a number that had been moving in the wrong direction for roughly a century, that the palace was measuring continuously in its own storerooms, and filing as a supply problem. Tonight we follow that number through 4 civilizations. The silver bleeding out of Roman coins 2 centuries before anyone called it a crisis. A Mycenaean accountant itemizing ivory furniture in the last week of his world. The final Maya monument carved at Tonina in the year 909, after which the count runs to 0 and stays there. And the 18-fold increase in the number of researchers it now takes to hold Moore's law steady. Get comfortable and stay to the end, because by then you will know why not one society in the entire archaeological record has ever recognised its own point of no return while standing on it, and why every instrument we use to check on ourselves reads the disease as health. If you want these episodes without ad breaks, that is over on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, which this channel is part of along with a handful of others. Ad-free versions of everything we make, early access before episodes go public, and the research archive behind each one. Subscribe or join if you haven't. Let's ease into it. There is a clay tablet in a museum in the western Peloponnese that exists entirely by accident. It is a flat, palm-sized slab, scratched with a stylus while the clay was still soft, and it was never meant to last more than a single accounting year. The palace scribes at Pylos wrote on unfired clay the way you would write on a whiteboard. When the year closed, the tablets were supposed to be soaked, pulped, kneaded back into blank slabs, and used again. Nothing written on them was intended to be permanent. They were shipping manifests and payroll records and inventory lists, and they were disposable by design. The reason you can read one today is that the palace burned. The fire that destroyed the palace of Nestor somewhere around 1200 BC got hot enough to fire the clay. It turned the most temporary documents in the Mycenaean world into ceramic. And this is not a quirk of one site. It is true of every Linear B tablet ever recovered, from Pylos, from Knossos, from Thebes, from Mycenae. We have no Mycenaean administrative records from a good year. Not one. The entire surviving written output of that civilization comes exclusively from buildings that were destroyed, because destruction is the only preservation mechanism that ever applied to it. If the Bronze Age had ended gently, we would have nothing. We would not even know the language. So we have the paperwork from the last days of a civilization. Thousands of documents from the exact window everyone wants to understand. And they are boring. That is the part that should stop you. The tablets from Pylos record a bureaucracy doing bureaucracy. There are lists of rowers assigned to coastal stations. There is a tablet, catalogued as JNE829, recording the collection of bronze from religious sanctuaries across the 16 administrative districts of the kingdom, which most scholars read as a requisition of temple metal, possibly for weapons. There are the tar tablets, an inventory of luxury furniture inlaid with ivory and gold and ebony, drawn up, as the text itself says. In the year the king appointed a man named Argewas to a governorship, somebody sat down in that palace and carefully itemized decorative tables. There are ration lists. There are records of women workers and their children. There is a famous and heavily disputed tablet, TN316, listing offerings of gold vessels and possibly people to various sanctuaries. which generations of scholars have read as evidence of a desperate final appeal to the gods, and which Thomas Palaima at the University of Texas has argued was already filed away in a storeroom before the last batch of tablets was even written. That argument matters more than it sounds, because what it means is that we genuinely cannot tell, from the documents themselves, whether the Pylos administration knew it was in an emergency. Some of the tablets look like panic, coastal watchers, requisitioned metal, offerings to the gods. Some of them look like an ordinary Tuesday. Furniture inventories, ration allocations, personnel assignments. And there is no marked difference in tone, no scribal hand that shakes, no annotation in the margin saying that things have gotten strange. The paperwork of a collapse and the paperwork of a normal year are, as physical objects, indistinguishable, which raises a question that is going to run underneath everything else. If a state can be 48 hours from the fire and still be filing furniture inventories, what exactly would it have taken for someone in that building to know? That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the actual technical problem, and it has a technical answer, and the answer is worse than the question. Because collapse is not an event. That is the thing nobody says out loud in the popular version. We talk about the fall of Rome and the collapse of the Maya and the end of the Bronze Age as though each one was a thing that happened, a date you could circle, a moment when the music stopped. Every one of those framings is a retrofit. What actually happens in every documented case is that a ratio changes sign. A society goes from getting more back than it puts in to getting less back than it puts in, and it keeps functioning for decades or centuries afterward on accumulated momentum and stored surplus, looking, from the inside, entirely fine, frequently looking better than fine, frequently looking like a golden age, because the peak of the curve and the crossing point are the same neighbourhood. There is no alarm attached to the crossing. There cannot be. The quantity that changes is a derivative, a rate of change of a rate of change, and human beings do not perceive derivatives. We perceive events. We are exquisitely tuned to detect a snapped branch and completely blind to a slope, and the record is unambiguous that this is how it goes. Not fast, not visible, not announced. I want to be careful here, because there is a genre of content that takes this material and turns it into either doom pornography or a political argument, and I am not interested in either. What I am interested in is that this is a measurement problem with an actual literature behind it, that the measurement has been performed on 4 separate civilizations with consistent results, that the same measurement has now been performed on the present, and that the result of that 4th measurement has been published in peer-reviewed journals by people at Stanford and MIT and Utah State, and nobody has done anything with it. Because there is nothing obvious to do with it, and because a number that says the returns turned negative in the 1970s does not fit into a news cycle. The framework belongs to a man named Joseph Tainter. In 1988, Cambridge University Press published a book of his called The Collapse of Complex Societies. It is not a long book. It is not a dramatic book. Tainter was an archaeologist, trained at Northwestern, and he spent most of his working life not in a famous university department, but inside the United States Forest Service at a research station in the Rocky Mountains, before eventually moving to Utah State to head the Department of Environment and Society. He is not a public intellectual. He has never had a documentary made about him. If you have heard the phrase diminishing returns on complexity, you have heard his argument second-hand, probably without the name attached, which is itself a small demonstration of what he was writing about. His argument has 4 steps, and they are all boring individually. Human societies are, functionally, problem-solving organizations. Solving problems requires energy, and maintaining the machinery that solves problems requires ongoing energy. As problems get solved, the society becomes more complex, meaning more specialized roles, more layers of administration, more infrastructure, more information processing, more coordination overhead. And complexity has a cost curve that is not linear. Here is the mechanism, and it is the single most important idea in this entire story, so I want to lay it out properly rather than gesture at it. When a society encounters a problem, it reaches for the cheapest available solution first. Obviously, nobody solves a problem the expensive way when a cheap way is sitting there. So the first irrigation ditch is dug on the flattest, wettest, most fertile ground closest to the river. The first mine is sunk where the ore is at the surface. The first layer of administration is added where the coordination gain is enormous, where having one person keep track of the grain saves 100 people from starving. Early complexity is spectacularly profitable. You put in 1 unit of energy and organisation and you get back 5, 10, 20, but those cheap solutions are consumed. They do not regenerate. The flat, wet, fertile ground is now farmed, so the next field goes on the slope, where it needs terracing, which needs labour, which needs food, which needs another field. The surface ore is gone, so the next shaft goes deeper, which needs timber and pumps and specialists. The obvious administrative gains have been captured, so the next bureaucrat added is not preventing a famine, he is auditing the man who audits the grain. Every additional unit of complexity is purchased at a higher price and returns a smaller benefit than the one before it, not because anyone is doing anything wrong, but because the good options were used first and by definition cannot be used again. Draw that as a curve. Benefit on the vertical axis, complexity on the horizontal. It rises steeply, then less steeply, then it flattens, and then, past a certain point, it turns over and comes down. Tainter called the region past that turned the zone of declining marginal returns, and his central claim is 1 sentence long. Once a society enters that zone, collapse becomes a mathematical likelihood requiring only time. Now hold on to the shape of that curve, because the shape is where the horror lives. At the moment the curve turns over, the society is not in decline, it is at its maximum. Maximum size, maximum wealth, maximum territory, maximum monumental construction, maximum cultural production, maximum confidence. The absolute peak of the benefit curve and the beginning of the fatal decline are not 2 different places. They are the same place. Total output is still at its all-time high. It is only the return on the next increment that has gone negative, and no society on Earth has ever measured the return on the next increment. Because that is not a thing that shows up in any record a society keeps about itself. What shows up in the records is that everything is bigger than it has ever been. Which is true, and which is exactly what you would expect to see at the crossing. So a society standing on the point of no return does not experience dread. It experiences a golden age. And I want to be blunt about the implication, because the polite version of this idea has been circulating in sustainability seminars for 35 years, with all the teeth filed off. The implication is that the feeling of civilizational confidence is not evidence of civilizational health. It is not evidence of anything. It is a lagging indicator at best, and an actively misleading one at worst, and every generation that has ever felt it has felt it with total sincerity, including the ones who were already on the wrong side of the curve. There is a second thing about Tainter's argument that gets sanded off in the retellings, and it is the part that made a lot of archaeologists uncomfortable in 1988. He does not think collapse is a catastrophe, he thinks it is an economizing process. His words. When the returns on complexity have gone sufficiently negative, complexity becomes a burden that the population is paying for and no longer benefiting from, and shedding it is a rational adjustment. The peasant who stops paying taxes to a state that no longer protects him is not a victim of collapse. He is the mechanism of it. He has correctly calculated that the marginal return on the state has gone negative for him personally, and he has withdrawn his investment. Multiply that by a few million people over a century, and you have what we later name as a Dark Age. And by several measures, Tainter argues, the people on the other side of a collapse are frequently better off. Shorter lives in some cases, smaller settlements, less art, less writing, but also less taxation, less conscription, less labour extraction, and more calories. That is a genuinely unpleasant idea, and it should be. It means collapse is not something that happens to a society against its will. It is something a society converges on, decision by rational decision, each one locally correct. But that is not the disturbing part. The disturbing part is the timing, and specifically the gap between when the ratio flips and when anyone notices anything at all. Because that gap is not a few years. In the cases we can date precisely, and we can now date several of them with startling precision, the gap runs from 50 years to more than 300, which means the entire lived experience of the generation that crossed the line, their whole adult lives, their careers, their children's childhoods, their sense of what a normal world felt like, occurred on the wrong side of it, and contained no information whatsoever that would have told them. We can do better than assert that. We can go and look, because in 3 separate cases the crossing left a numerical trace in the archaeological record, a quantity that was recorded year by year for other reasons entirely, that we can now read as a diagnostic even though the people producing it had no idea they were producing a diagnostic. In Rome it was the silver content of the coinage. In the Bronze Age it was the metal supply chain. Among the classic Maya, it was the number of stone monuments carved per decade. 3 different civilizations, 3 different data streams, and the same signature in all 3. A ratio degrading smoothly for decades before anything visible happens. Then a period where the state responds by adding complexity, which is the worst possible response and the only one that has ever been tried, and then a long, quiet, undramatic unwinding that contemporary writers barely mention, because from the inside it did not look like an unwinding, it looked like a Tuesday. And then there is the 4th measurement, the one taken on us, which uses different instruments, published in different journals, by economists rather than archaeologists, and produces the same curve with the same sign change, and which we have been publishing continuously and openly since about 1972. I need to warn you about something before we go into the cases, because it changes how the rest of this lands. The instruments we use to tell whether a society is doing well are, almost without exception, measuring the wrong quantity. They measure total output, gross domestic product, total employment, total research spending, total energy consumption, total number of scientists, total mileage of road. Every one of those numbers keeps going up on both sides of the turn. Every one of them was at an all-time high in Rome under Marcus Aurelius, and in the Maya lowlands in the year 790, and in the eastern Mediterranean in the decade before the palaces burned. The quantity that flips sign is the ratio. Output per unit of input. Benefit per additional increment of complexity. And we have that number too. We have had it for a long time. It is just not the number anyone reports. And there is a reason for that, which has nothing to do with conspiracy, and everything to do with the fact that a rising total is a good headline, and a falling ratio is a graph on page 40 of a working paper. Keep that in mind. We will come back to it, and when we do, it is going to be considerably worse than it sounds right now. Start with Rome, because Rome is the case everyone thinks they know, and because the popular version of Rome is wrong in a specific way that matters. The version you were handed at school has a date attached to it. 476 AD. A Germanic officer named Odoacer deposes a teenage emperor called Romulus Augustulus, and the Western Roman Empire ends. That date is a filing convenience. It is not history. Romulus Augustulus was a usurper's son who had been installed by his father less than a year earlier. He was never recognised as legitimate by the Eastern court at Constantinople, which continued to regard a different man, Julius Nepos, as the lawful Western emperor until Nepos was murdered in 480. When Odoacer removed the boy, he did not declare himself emperor. He did something stranger and much more revealing. He packed up the imperial regalia and shipped it east, with a message saying that the West no longer required a separate emperor, and that he would govern Italy as a subordinate of Constantinople. He kept the Senate, he kept the consuls, he kept the tax system, the law courts, the administration, the coinage. Nobody in Italy woke up that morning in a different country. There is no contemporary source that treats 476 as the end of anything. The date was elevated to significance centuries later, largely by historians looking backward for a place to put a bookmark, and Edward Gibbon cemented it in the 18th century. So when did it actually happen? The honest answer is that the interesting crossing occurred roughly 300 years earlier, during the period Gibbon himself described as the happiest and most prosperous in the history of the human race. Here is the diagnostic. Rome ran on silver. The standard coin, the denarius, was the unit that paid the legions, settled the contracts, and moved the grain, and its silver content is recoverable today from surviving coins by direct metallurgical assay. This gives us something almost unique in ancient history: a continuous, quantitative, year-by-year measurement of the fiscal health of a state, produced by that state, in physical objects that survive in the hundreds of thousands. Under Augustus, at the start of the imperial period, the denarius ran at roughly 95 to 98% silver. Under Nero, in the currency reform of 64 AD, the coin was both lightened and diluted, dropping to somewhere in the low 90s. Trajan cut it again around 107 AD. Under Antoninus Pius it sits in the low 80s. Under Marcus Aurelius it falls into the low 70s. Septimius Severus, in the 190s AD, takes it to roughly 50%, which means he can mint twice as many coins from the same weight of bullion as Augustus could. His son Caracalla, in 215, introduces an entirely new coin, the Antoninianus, which is tariffed at 2 denarii and contains about 1.5 denarii worth of silver, which is a tax on everyone holding money, implemented by fiat, in public. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, the silver coin of the Roman Empire is a bronze token with a silver wash on the surface, containing under 5% actual silver, and in some issues closer to 2. I should flag that numismatists argue about the individual figures. Different mints, different years, and different assay methods produce different percentages, and some of the numbers you will see quoted online are firmer than the underlying evidence supports. But nobody argues about the shape. The shape is a smooth, continuous, 250-year slide with almost no reversals, and the slide begins long before there is any visible crisis to explain it. That is what a marginal return curve looks like from the inside. Not a crash, a slope. And now hold the two things next to each other. In the middle of the 2nd century AD, when Marcus Aurelius is on the throne, and the empire is at its maximum territorial extent, and Gibbon's happiest age is underway, the currency is already about a quarter of the way through its collapse, and the state is already structurally unable to cover its commitments at the existing tax rate. Both things are simultaneously true. The Golden Age and the Crossing are the same decades. Then, the Antonine Plague arrives. It reaches the empire around 165 AD. carried back by troops returning from the eastern campaigns, and it runs for roughly 15 years, with a recurrence in 189. Galen, the greatest physician of the ancient world, was present for it, and left a clinical description that has kept epidemiologists arguing for a century and a half, though the modern consensus leans towards smallpox. The mortality estimates run between 5 and 10 million dead, with some scholars pushing to 12 out of a population of perhaps 60 to 70 million, roughly 10% of the empire. Localized mortality in dense cities considerably higher. Dio Cassius, writing about the later outbreak, reports 2,000 deaths a day in Rome at the peak. Now watch what the state does, because this is the pattern that repeats in every case in this story. Marcus Aurelius needed to fund the Marcomannic Wars on the Danube at exactly the moment the tax base and the recruitment pool had been gutted. He could not raise the money conventionally, so in 169 he auctioned imperial property. Palace furnishings, works of art, his wife's silk and gold clothing, ceremonial goods, sold publicly in the Forum of Trajan over a period of months to raise cash for a war. The emperor of the largest state on earth was liquidating the furniture. The 19th century historian Barthold Georg Niebuhr wrote that the ancient world never recovered from the blow inflicted on it in the reign of Marcus Aurelius. That may overstate the plague's role as a single cause. Almost every monocausal explanation in this field overstates. But something does change, and we can see it in evidence that has nothing to do with literary sources and no possible political agenda attached to it. There is lead in the Greenland ice sheet. Roman silver was extracted from lead ores by smelting, a filthy process that vented lead vapour into the atmosphere, some fraction of which drifted north and settled onto Greenland and was buried under successive annual snowfalls, layer by layer, for 2,000 years. Drill a core, count the layers, measure the lead, and you have a year-by-year proxy for the industrial output of the ancient Mediterranean. The work goes back to a study by Hong and colleagues published in Science in 1994, and it has been refined substantially since, most notably by Joseph McConnell and his collaborators in a series of papers around 2018. The curve rises through the late Republic, peaks in the early imperial period, and then falls. It does not fall in 476. It falls in the 2nd century, tracks the Antonine plague, and never fully recovers. There is a second independent proxy, and it agrees. Shipwrecks, Anthony Parker's catalogue, published in 1992, documents 1,189 wreck sites across the Mediterranean and the Roman provinces, and since the number of ships that sink is roughly proportional to the number of ships that sail, the distribution of wrecks by century gives you a crude but real index of maritime trade volume. That index peaks in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD and declines thereafter. Parker himself is careful about the limitations and notes that for around a quarter of the sites the reporting is so thin that neither depth nor condition is recorded. But again, the shape holds across independent datasets that have no reason to agree. Lead in the ice, wrecks on the seabed, silver in the coins. 3 unrelated measurements. Same turn. Same century, and the century they all point to is the one that Roman writers themselves describe as the height of the empire's fortune. But none of that is what makes the Roman case unnerving. What makes it unnerving is what the state did once the returns had clearly gone negative, because the response was not retrenchment. The response was more complexity, applied harder, by intelligent and competent men who could see something was wrong and had exactly one tool. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire cycles through something like 26 emperors and claimants in 50 years. In 260, the Emperor Valerian is captured alive by the Persian king Shapur I at Edessa, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner in war, and spends the rest of his life as a trophy. Persian sources say Shapur used him as a human mounting block when getting on his horse. Lactantius, admittedly the most hostile witness available, says he was flayed after death and his skin dyed and hung in a temple between 271 and 275. The Emperor Aurelian builds a wall around the city of Rome. 19 kilometers of brick faced concrete, in some places 6 meters high before later heightening. The capital of the Mediterranean world had not needed walls for 500 years. The construction of that wall is an administrative document. It says, in the most expensive possible language, that the people running the empire had concluded the city itself could be attacked. Then, Diocletian arrives, and Diocletian is the purest example in the historical record of the pattern I am describing, which is a competent leader responding to declining returns on complexity by purchasing more complexity. He takes power in 284. He looks at an empire that has proven ungovernable by one man, and he splits the command 4 ways. The Tetrarchy, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior, from 293. He looks at provinces that have proven too large to control, and he subdivides them, taking the count from roughly 50 to nearly 100, then grouping them into 12 dioceses with a new supervisory layer on top. He expands the army substantially, with estimates ranging from a baseline near 300,000 up to figures of 400,000 or more, and the exact numbers are genuinely contested. He restructures taxation entirely, replacing the old system with the capitatio and augatio, a head tax and a land tax assessed on units of productive capacity, which requires an empire-wide census of people and land conducted repeatedly. And in 301, facing inflation that his own debasement had produced, he issues the Edict on Maximum Prices, fixing the legal ceiling on more than 1,000 goods and services across the entire empire, with the death penalty attached. The edict failed completely. Goods left the legal market. The prices were ignored. It is one of the best documented price control failures in history, and it was enforced by a state that could not enforce it. Every one of those reforms is defensible. Every one of them addressed a real problem, and the aggregate effect was to roughly double the overhead cost of the Roman state at the exact moment its productive base was contracting. Lactantius, who hated Diocletian for religious reasons, and whose numbers should be read as polemic rather than accounting, wrote the line that everyone quotes, in chapter 7 of his account of the deaths of the persecutors. The empire had been quartered, he says, the armies multiplied, each of the 4 princes maintaining a larger force than any sole emperor before them, and then this. There began to be fewer men who paid taxes than there were who received wages. The result, he continues, was that the resources of the farmers were exhausted by enormous impositions. The fields were abandoned, cultivated ground became woodland, and universal dismay prevailed. Take the specific ratio with a fistful of salt. He was a propagandist. But the underlying dynamic is corroborated by the legislation, and the legislation is not propaganda, because a state does not pass laws against a problem it does not have. Farmers were abandoning the land. We know this because the state made it illegal. A constitution associated with Constantine, commonly dated to 332, binds tenant farmers, the coloni, to the estates they work, with penalties for flight and obligations on anyone sheltering a runaway. Over the following century, the same logic gets extended to more and more occupations: bakers, shippers, minters, soldiers' sons. The state, unable to make participation attractive, made exit illegal. That is what the terminal phase of a complexity curve looks like administratively. Not tyranny for its own sake, desperate maintenance, a machine that has to be bolted to the floor because it will otherwise walk away. And people did leave. This is the detail I keep coming back to, because it is the closest thing we have to an interview with someone living through it. In 448 AD, a Byzantine diplomat named Priscus travelled to the court of Attila as part of an embassy, and he wrote it up. Somewhere in the Hunnic camp, he is approached by a man dressed as a Scythian who greets him in Greek. Priscus is startled, and the man explains that he is a Greek merchant, originally from the town of Diminishing on the Danube, who was captured by the Huns in a raid, fought well enough in their service to win his freedom, and then chose to stay. He then explains why, and the reasons are itemized. The taxes in the empire are crushing, the administration is corrupt, and the legal system, which is supposed to be the great achievement of Roman civilization, is so slow and so expensive that a poor man cannot obtain justice from it, while a rich man can purchase whatever verdict he requires. Priscus argues back. He gives a long defense of Roman law and constitutional order, and at the end of it, the man weeps and concedes the point, but the concession is very precise. He says the laws are good. He says the men administering them have ruined the state. That conversation happened roughly 28 years before the date in the textbook, and nowhere in it does either participant use the language of collapse. They are having an argument about tax policy and judicial corruption. Two men standing in the wreckage, discussing administrative efficiency. Now, there is a version of this story where the moral is that Rome was rotten and everyone could see it. That version is also wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters for where this is going. Because at the same time, the Roman elite were writing some of the most confident prose in the language. In 417 AD, 7 years after Alaric's Goths had sacked the city of Rome itself, a Gallo-Roman aristocrat named Rutilius Nematianus, who had served as prefect of the city, sailed north up the Italian coast on his way home to Gaul. He wrote a poem about the journey. He passes ruined towns, he notes the damage, and in the middle of it he addresses the goddess Roma directly, and delivers a line that has been quoted for 1600 years. "The law of your rebirth," he writes, "is the power to grow from your misfortunes. That which destroys all other kingdoms merely renews you." He was not being ironic, he meant it. He was a serious, educated, well-travelled man of affairs, looking directly at the physical evidence of decline, and what he concluded was that Rome renews itself through catastrophe. A generation later, Sidonius Apollinaris, another Gallo-Roman aristocrat, who also served as prefect of Rome and later became Bishop of Clermont, left 24 poems and 147 letters documenting a world of villa life, literary dinner parties, elegant verse exchanges, hunting, and bathhouse gossip among the Gallic nobility. That correspondence continues while the Visigothic king Euric is dismantling Roman authority in Gaul and eventually besieging Sidonius in his own city. The letters record both, salons and sieges, in the same voice, sometimes in the same month. These men were not stupid and they were not in denial in any clinical sense. They were doing the thing every human being does, which is to treat the conditions of their own lifetime as the baseline definition of normal, and to interpret variation around that baseline as weather rather than climate. That is the mechanism, not ignorance, not cowardice. Calibration, and here is the part I want to plant now, because it comes back at the end of this and it is the actual point of the whole thing. Every one of those men had access to the diagnostic. The coins were in their pockets. Rutilius Nematianus was handling, every single day, physical objects containing a quarter of the silver their equivalents had contained under Augustus, and there is no indication in the entire corpus of Latin literature that anyone read that as information about the trajectory of the state. They knew prices were rising. They complained about it constantly. They had the number in their hands, and they experienced it as an annoyance about the cost of things. The signal was not hidden, it was in circulation. But Rome is the easy case, because Rome took centuries and left libraries. If you want to see how thin the margin actually is, you need a system that was more sophisticated, more interconnected, more optimized, and that came apart faster than anyone can currently explain. Somewhere around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was running the most integrated economy the world had ever produced, and it was doing it on an alloy. Bronze is copper and tin at roughly 10 parts to 1. Every weapon, every plough tip, every chisel, every cauldron. Every fitting on every chariot in the Late Bronze Age was made of it, and the entire technological base of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Assyria, Babylon, Cyprus and the Canaanite city-states depended on a continuous supply of both metals. Copper was manageable. Cyprus had enormous deposits. So much that the island's name and the metal's name are entangled. Tin was the problem. There is almost no tin in the Eastern Mediterranean. The tin came from Central Asia, from the region of modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, moving west overland through Mesopotamia in a chain of transactions across thousands of kilometers. And, according to lead isotope work published in recent years, some of it came from Cornwall, in Britain, at the opposite end of the known world. Think about what that means structurally. Not a single kingdom in the Bronze Age controlled both halves of its own core technology. The Hittites could not make a sword without material that had crossed multiple foreign borders. Egypt could not equip an army without imports. Every state in the system was dependent on the continued functioning of every other state in the system, and none of them had a domestic alternative, because there was no domestic alternative to have. They built a globalized supply chain for a strategic material, and then they built their entire civilization on top of it. This is Eric Klein's argument, laid out in his 2014 book from Princeton, which takes its title from the year 1177 BC, and in the sequel he published in 2021. Klein is an archaeologist at George Washington University who has spent decades excavating in Israel, and his central claim is that no single cause brings this world down. It is a systems collapse. Earthquakes, drought, famine, internal rebellion, population movement, and the severing of trade routes, arriving in overlapping waves, in a system whose interdependence had become its principal vulnerability. The date in his title is chosen deliberately and slightly provocatively. 1177 BC is year 8 of the reign of Rameses III, the year Egyptian sources record a great naval and land battle against a coalition of foreign peoples. He picked it as a symbol, not a hinge, and he says so, which brings me to the first thing the popular version gets badly wrong. You have probably encountered the Sea Peoples. Mysterious marauders from nowhere who swept across the Mediterranean in a wave of destruction and toppled the Bronze Age. It is a wonderful story, and it is almost entirely a 19th century invention. Start with the name. The Egyptians never used it. There is no ancient term corresponding to Sea Peoples. It was coined by a French Egyptologist in the 1880s, and it has been shaping how everyone thinks about this period ever since. What the Egyptian texts actually give us, in the reliefs and inscriptions at the mortuary temple of Rameses III at Medinet Habu, is a list of specific named groups: the Peleset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Shardana, the Danuna, the Weshish. The inscription says that no land could stand before their arms, and it describes them moving with their families, their cattle, and their possessions in carts. That is not a raiding party. That is a migration. The modern reading, which is now close to consensus among people who work on this material, largely inverts the popular story. The Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse. They were a consequence of it. They were displaced populations, driven out of somewhere else by drought and famine and the failure of their own systems, moving into a region that was already breaking and accelerating the breakage when they arrived. Blaming them for the Bronze Age collapse is like blaming a refugee column for a war, and we can be specific about what was actually happening, because these were literate societies and their letters survive. There is a Hittite royal letter demanding an urgent shipment of grain, a very large one, in the range of hundreds of tons, which ends with the statement that it is a matter of life and death. There is correspondence showing the pharaoh Meneptah sending grain to the Hittites during a famine around 1210 BC, which is remarkable in itself, since Egypt and Hatti had been the two superpowers competing for the same territory for 2 centuries. There is a letter from the city of Emar, on the Euphrates, written not long before the city was destroyed around 1185 BC, which reads, in translation, that there is famine in the house, that they will all die of hunger, and that if the recipient does not arrive quickly, they will die. And then there is Ugarit. Ugarit was a wealthy port city on the Syrian coast, one of the great commercial hubs of the age, with a royal palace, a merchant class, and an archive. Its last king was named Amurapi. The final letters from his court include one to the king of Alashia, generally identified as Cyprus, in which Amurapi explains that enemy ships have appeared, that his own fleet is away in Lycian waters and his army is away in Hittite territory, and that his cities have been burned and terrible things done in his country. The letter was found in a kiln. It had been written on a clay tablet, placed in the oven to be fired for dispatch, and it was still there when the city burned. It was never sent. Ugarit was destroyed and never reoccupied. The site was not rebuilt. Nothing was built on top of it. The city simply stops. And it was not alone. Across a window of roughly 50 to 100 years, depending on whose dating you accept, the following places are destroyed or abandoned. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, a city of enormous fortifications in central Anatolia. Ugarit, Amar, Alalak, Ashkelon, Hazor, Troy, in the layer conventionally labelled 7a Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes in Greece, Pylos, dozens of smaller sites. The dating is genuinely disputed, and I want to be clear about that. Because the popular telling compresses everything into a single dramatic year, and the reality is a cluster spread across generations, with individual destructions arguable by 50 years in either direction. But the cluster is real, and nothing like it happens again in that region for a very long time. Underneath all of it, the climate data. David Koniuski and Elise Van Campo and their colleagues have published a series of pollen studies from cores taken at the Larnaca Salt Lake in Cyprus and at Tel Twaini on the Syrian coast. And the picture that emerges, stated in their 2019 paper in Regional Environmental Change, is that the Late Bronze Age crisis and the Dark Age that follows are framed by a drought episode, lasting approximately 300 years. The event has a formal name in the paleoclimate literature, the 3.2 kiloyear event, and it shows up independently in speleothems from Sorek Cave, in pollen from the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, and in tree ring sequences from Anatolia. Now, drought does not destroy a civilization. This is where the popular climate story overreaches, and it is worth being precise. These societies survived droughts constantly. Egypt had famine relief systems. Grain was stored. The whole point of a palace economy is that it accumulates surplus in good years to distribute in bad ones. A single failed harvest is an inconvenience. What kills you is consecutive failed harvests across the entire trade network simultaneously, when every partner you would normally borrow from is having the same problem, and when the surplus you had banked has already been spent covering the last 3 years. That is not a drought problem. That is a margin problem. The drought is only fatal because the system had no slack left, and the reason it had no slack left is that 3 centuries of optimization had converted every buffer into throughput. Every granary of reserve had become a shipment. Every redundant supplier had been consolidated into an efficient one. The late Bronze Age economy was, by the standards of its time, magnificently optimized, and optimization and fragility are the same word viewed from different angles. And now I want to come back to Pylos, because I left something there. The tablets, the ones baked by the fire that destroyed the palace. We now know what was happening in the wider world when those tablets were written. The trade network was failing, the Hittites were starving, Ugarit was about to be erased. Emar was writing letters about dying of hunger. That is the context. That is what was going on outside the windows of the room, where a scribe was itemizing tables with ivory inlays. And here is the detail that I find genuinely difficult to sit with. Read the Jane 8:29 tablet again in that light. The palace is collecting bronze from religious sanctuaries across 16 districts. Temple metal. The stuff you take last. The reason you would strip a temple is that you cannot get metal any other way, which means the tin has stopped arriving, which means the palace at Pylos knew at the level of raw materials on a loading dock that the supply chain had failed. They knew about the shortage. They responded to it competently and rationally by locating alternative supply within their own territory. And there is no evidence anywhere in that archive that anyone connected the shortage to anything larger. It was a procurement problem. Somebody solved it. Somebody else filed the furniture inventory. I keep coming back to this because it is the single clearest example I know of a society holding the diagnostic in its hands and reading it as an operational issue. The metal supply is the ratio. The metal supply is the entire load-bearing dependency of the civilization, and when it degrades, that is not a logistics hiccup. That is the number-changing sign. And it was processed by the relevant institution as a requisition. That is the second time now. Rome had the silver content of its own coinage and experienced it as inflation. Pylos had the collapse of the tin trade and experienced it as a sourcing challenge. In both cases, the state was measuring the correct quantity at high resolution continuously, and interpreting it as an operational nuisance rather than a structural verdict, because there was no institutional category available into which the structural verdict could be placed. Hold on to that. It is going to happen a third time, and then it is going to happen to us. And the fourth time it happens, the number is going to be published in a journal by 4 economists, and the response will be a citation count. What happened after Pylos is worth stating plainly, because this is where the Bronze Age case becomes genuinely alarming rather than merely sad. Writing stops. Linear B is a syllabic script used to record Mycenaean Greek, and after the palaces burn it, simply disappears from the archaeological record. Not because Greek disappears, but because the administrative apparatus that used writing disappears, and writing in that world existed only as a tool of palace accounting. There were no novels in Linear B. There was no poetry. There was inventory. And when the inventories stopped, the technology of literacy went with them. Greece is without writing for approximately 400 years. The alphabet, borrowed from Phoenician, appears around 800 BC. 4 centuries is not a gap. It is longer than the United States has existed as an independent country, twice over. Homer sits somewhere near the end of that darkness, composing orally about a Bronze Age world that had by then become mythology, transmitting garbled memories of palaces nobody alive had ever seen. Population estimates for the Greek Dark Age are very rough, and I would treat any specific percentage you see quoted with suspicion, since they are extrapolated from settlement surveys rather than measured. But the surveys agree on direction and rough magnitude. Site counts fall dramatically. Settlements shrink. Monumental construction stops entirely. Long-distance trade goods vanish from the record. And then there is the thing that happens next, which almost nobody frames correctly. They switch to iron. The conventional telling is that the Iron Age begins because iron is better than bronze. That is not what the metallurgy says. Early iron worked with the techniques available in the 12th and 11th centuries BC is not obviously superior to good bronze. It is harder to work, requires much higher temperatures, and the earliest iron implements are frequently inferior to the bronze they replace. If you were a smith in 1150 BC and someone handed you a choice, you would take the bronze. Iron won for one reason. Iron ore is everywhere. It is in the ground in Greece, in Anatolia, in Italy, in the Levant, in bog deposits, and surface outcrops across the entire region. It requires no Afghan trade route. It requires no Cypriot shipping. It requires no diplomatic relationship with a distant empire whose grain harvest just failed. The successor civilization did not adopt a better technology. It adopted a more independent one. It looked at what had just happened, and it selected, whether consciously or by simple survival filtering, for supply chain resilience over performance. That is the only case I know of in the historical record where a civilization appears to have actually learnt the lesson, and it took the total destruction of the previous world and 400 years of illiteracy to teach it. Now I want to name something before we move on, because it has been building since the beginning of this, and it is the thing this whole story is actually about. Every case we have looked at so far had a number. Rome had the silver assay, Pylos had the tin. In both cases, the number was being produced continuously by the society's own core institutions as a byproduct of ordinary operations. In both cases, it was moving in the wrong direction for decades before anything visible happened, and in both cases, the people holding it interpreted it as noise, or as a problem in a different department. But that is not quite the full statement of the problem, and the full statement is worse. In both cases, the years when the number was degrading fastest were the years those societies experienced as their most successful. Severan Rome was militarily formidable and architecturally spectacular. The 13th century BC Eastern Mediterranean was the richest, most connected, most cosmopolitan world that had ever existed, with kings exchanging gold and glass and diplomatic marriages across 4 empires. The degradation of the ratio and the sensation of peak civilization are not merely coincidental, they are causally linked, because the same expansion in complexity that produces the sensation is what drives the ratio down. Which means the feeling of living in a golden age is not a false signal. It is a correctly functioning signal pointed at the wrong quantity, and it reads highest at precisely the moment the underlying number is worst. We do not have an instrument that reads the disease. We have an instrument that reads the symptom of the disease and displays it as health. Sit with that one, because it is the shape of the entire thing. And the third case is the one where a civilization saw the number falling and responded by carving it into stone, faster and faster, right up to the last one. The classic Maya kept a calendar so precise that we can date individual political events in the 8th century to the day. The long count is an absolute count of elapsed days from a fixed origin point. And Maya kings had a habit that turns out to be the single most useful diagnostic instrument any ancient civilization ever handed to archaeology. At regular calendrical intervals, particularly at the end of each Khatun, a period of about 19.5 years, and often at the halfway point as well, a king would commission a carved stone monument. A stela. It recorded the date, his name, his lineage, his accession, his victories, his ritual acts. This was not optional. It was the core obligation of divine kingship. A king who did not raise a monument on the appropriate date was a king who was failing at the fundamental function of the office, which was to keep the calendar and the cosmos in alignment. Erecting the stela was the job, which means that the number of Maya sites erecting dated monuments in any given decade is a direct, quantitative, year-by-year index of how many functioning royal courts existed in the lowlands. It is a census of political capacity, carved in limestone by the institutions being measured, for 800 years. Here is what it does. The count climbs steadily through the classic period. It rises through the 7th century. It rises through the 8th. It reaches its all-time maximum somewhere around the year 790, when the largest number of independent Maya polities in history are simultaneously carving dates into stone. That is the peak. That is the moment the classic Maya world is at its fullest expression, with more cities, more kings, more monuments. More warfare, more construction, more population than at any previous point. Then it falls off a cliff. Within a few decades, the number of participating sites is a fraction of what it was. Calakmul, one of the two great superpowers of the classic era, stops around 810. Copan's last dated inscription is 822. Tikal, the other superpower, the city with the great pyramids that you have seen in photographs, puts up stellar 11 in 869 and then goes silent. Oxkintok manages 859. And the final long count date carved anywhere in the entire Maya world appears at a site called Tonin in Chiapas, on a monument catalogued as Monument 101, corresponding to January of 909 AD. After that, nothing, the count runs to 0 and stays there. So there it is, the third instrument. Rome had silver, Pylos had tin, the Maya had monuments, and in all three cases the society was producing the measurement itself, continuously, for reasons that had nothing to do with measurement. But the Maya case has something the other two do not, and it is the reason I think this is the most important of the three. We can independently measure what the population was doing while the monuments were stopping. The work was done at Cop in western Honduras by David Webster and Antonine Freta, and the technique is obsidian hydration dating. When a piece of obsidian is fractured, the freshly exposed surface begins absorbing water from the atmosphere at a rate that is slow, measurable, and roughly predictable given known temperature conditions. Cut a thin section, measure the depth of the hydration rim under a microscope, and you get a date for when that flake was struck. Obsidian tools are ubiquitous in Maya household debris, so if you excavate enough house mounds and date enough flakes, you can reconstruct the occupation history of an entire valley, household by household, without reference to a single royal inscription. Webster and Freta processed 2,048 obsidian hydration dates from the Copan Valley. It remains one of the largest datasets of its kind in Mesoamerica. What it shows, in the paper they published in Latin American Antiquity in 1990, is that the royal collapse and the population collapse are two completely different events separated by centuries. The Cop Valley population peaks somewhere around 750 to 800 AD, at somewhere in the range of 20 to 30,000 people, with the most commonly cited figure around 26,000. The royal dynasty ends abruptly around the year 800. Their phrase for it is an abrupt royal collapse, but elite activity below the royal level continues for another 200 years. And the general population does not crash. It declines, gradually over roughly 4 centuries, with people still living in the valley in reduced numbers into the 13th century. 400 years. The kings vanish in a generation, and the farmers take 400 years to finish leaving. Which means the thing we call the Maya collapse, the event, the mystery, the one in the documentaries, was the failure of a specific political technology in a specific region. And the population it governed experienced it as a very slow change in circumstances spread across roughly 16 generations. Nobody in that valley ever lived through the collapse. Everybody in that valley lived through a slightly worse version of what their parents had. And that brings me to the correction that this whole subject demands, because the popular framing here is not just imprecise, it is offensive, and it is repeated constantly. The Maya did not disappear. There are somewhere in the region of 11 million Maya people alive right now, roughly 7 million in Guatemala, according to the 2018 census, several million in southern Mexico, more in Belize and Honduras. Around 6 million people actively speak one of approximately 30 living Mayan languages. In the Guatemalan highlands, there are daykeepers who have maintained the 260-day ritual calendar continuously since the Classic period, which means that the calendar count itself, the same one used to date those stelae, has never actually stopped running. It has been kept by human beings hand to hand for well over 2,000 years. Meanwhile, the northern Yucatan did not collapse at all. Chichen Itza rises to dominance in exactly the period the southern lowlands are going quiet, and Mayapan after it. The civilization moved and reorganized. What ended was a particular arrangement of divine kingship in a particular set of southern cities, and calling that the disappearance of a people is a category error that has been reproduced in textbooks and television for a century. So what actually happened in those southern cities? They ran the curve, all of it visibly in the archaeology. The Maya lowlands are not natural farmland. The soils are thin, the karst terrain drains unpredictably, there is no surface water in much of the Petan, and rainfall is seasonal and unreliable. Supporting a large population there is an engineering achievement, and the Maya achieved it by continuously adding complexity, terracing hillsides that would otherwise erode, constructing raised fields in wetlands, excavating enormous reservoirs to store the wet season rainfall through the dry months, which at Tikal reached a scale sufficient to supply tens of thousands of people, intensifying cropping cycles, expanding onto increasingly marginal land. Every one of those is a rational solution to a real problem. Every one of them costs more labour per calorie returned than the solution before it. That is the curve, drawn in soil, and we can see the cost landing on human bodies. Rebecca Story's analysis of skeletal remains from Copan document rising rates of malnutrition and physiological stress in the urban population during the late Classic, the same period the monuments are peaking. Growth disruption. Anemia. The population that built the greatest achievements of classic Maya civilization was measurably less healthy than the population that preceded it. Then, on top of all that, the rain fails. The drought evidence for the Maya is now some of the best resolved paleoclimate data anywhere in the world for any ancient civilization. The foundational work is Hodel, Curtis and Brenner in Nature in 1995, using sediment cores from Lake Chichicanab in the Yucatan, which found a severe dry interval coinciding with the terminal classic. That has since been enormously refined. Douglas Kennett and colleagues published a study in Science in 2012 using a stalagmite from Yok Balam Cave in Belize, which grew steadily enough to give near-annual resolution across 2,000 years of rainfall history, and which allows direct correlation between specific dry intervals and the dated inscriptional record of warfare and political fragmentation. And in 2018, a team led by Nicholas Evans published isotopic work on gypsum from Chichicanab, estimating that annual rainfall during the collapse interval fell by somewhere between 41 and 54%, with peak reductions substantially worse. Cut the rain in half in a place with no rivers, where you have already pushed agriculture onto marginal land, where the soil is depleted, where the population is at maximum, and where the entire political system rests on the king's claim to control the relationship between the sky and the harvest. But here is the part that matters for this story, and it is the reason I put the Maya third instead of second. Watch what the kings did as it got worse. They did not scale back. Monumental construction in the decades leading up to 800 AD does not decrease. It intensifies. The number of monuments carved goes up. The scale of building projects goes up. Warfare increases, and we can see it in the inscriptions and in the archaeology of fortification, with defensive walls appearing at sites that had never needed them. At Aguateca in the Petexpan region, the elite built a defensive perimeter running several kilometres around the site in roughly the decades between 790 and 810. It did not work. Aguateca was attacked, burned, and abandoned, and the manner of the abandonment makes it one of the most extraordinary sites in Mesoamerican archaeology. Takeshi Inamata's excavations found elite residences that had burned so quickly, with roofs collapsing so fast that the contents were sealed in place. Grinding stones still in position, tools where they were set down, scribal equipment, musical instruments, ornaments left behind. It is one of the very few Maya sites where you can see what a room actually contained on a specific afternoon, because the people in it did not have time to pack. At Cancun around the year 800, archaeologists found the remains of roughly 31 members of the royal household, dismembered, deposited in a sacred cistern. The king and queen were buried separately nearby. The city was abandoned immediately afterward. That is the terminal phase, not a slow fade. A concentrated burst of construction, warfare, ritual investment, and elite violence, right at the end, in the decades on either side of the peak of the monument count. And that is exactly what the model predicts, which is the thing that should unsettle you. When the returns on your current strategy fall, and your entire institutional structure exists to execute that strategy, and your legitimacy is founded on your ability to execute it, the available response is not to abandon it, it is to execute it harder. A Maya king facing crop failure and political challenge did not have the option of concluding that divine kingship had entered a zone of declining marginal returns. He had the option of commissioning a larger monument, conducting more elaborate rituals, and going to war with his neighbour. Every additional stela was a rational act by an intelligent person operating inside an institution, and the aggregate of all those rational acts is the spike right before the flat line. I want to give you one more thing from the Maya case, because 2018 changed the scale of the entire question. A consortium called Pacunam flew LiDAR over the Guatemalan Petén, using aircraft-mounted lasers that penetrate the forest canopy and map the ground surface underneath at high resolution. The survey covered 2,144 square kilometres, and the results were published in Science in September of that year by Marcelo Canuto, Francisco Estrada Belli, and their colleagues. They found 1,480 structures, not sites, structures, house platforms, causeways, terraces, reservoirs, fortifications, agricultural infrastructure, all of it invisible from the ground under 100 feet of jungle, all of it mapped in a few weeks of flying. Canuto's assessment was that the Maya lowland population had been underestimated by a factor of 2 to 3, and the revised figures put the classic period population somewhere in the range of 7 to 11 million people, with some estimates running higher. Which reframes everything. This was not a scattering of ceremonial centres in a forest. It was a densely settled, intensively engineered, fully landscaped region supporting a population comparable to a modern European country, on karst soil, without draft animals, without the wheel, without metal tools. And it was gone. Not the people, as we established, but the system that organised them, the political technology that made the reservoirs get dug and the terraces get maintained and the causeways stay clear, that went, and it went in something like a century and a half, and the forest took the rest. 3 civilizations, 3 instruments, the same reading in all 3. In every case, the ratio degraded first, silently, for decades. In every case, the peak of visible achievement sat right on top of the crossing. In every case, the institutional response to falling returns was to purchase more of what was already failing. And in every case, the people who lived through it left a written or carved record that says, unmistakably that they thought they were living in a functioning world. Now, I have been building towards something, and I want to close the loop on the historical section before we look at the present, because there is one more correction to make, and it cuts against the entire genre this material usually gets used for. The most famous collapse story in popular culture is Easter Island. Rapa Nui, a society that supposedly cut down its own forests to move giant statues, destroyed its ecological base, crashed into famine and warfare and cannibalism, and left the Moai standing over an empty grassland as a parable about human self-destruction. Jared Diamond made it the centerpiece of his 2005 book Collapse. It is taught in schools. It is the most cited environmental morality tale of the last 20 years. The evidence has been going against it for a decade, and it is now, at minimum, deeply compromised. Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo argued in their 2011 book that the deforestation was driven substantially by Polynesian rats, introduced with the settlers, which ate the palm seeds and prevented regeneration, and that the Moai were moved upright by small teams using ropes, a technique they demonstrated experimentally, which removes the need for the enormous population and enormous timber consumption the standard story requires. Their later analysis of the island's rock garden agriculture argued the island could never have supported the population the ecocide narrative assumes in the first place. And then in September of 2024, a team led by Moreno Mayer published ancient genomes from 15 Rapa Nui individuals in Nature. If there had been a catastrophic population crash before European contact, it would be visible in the genetic data as a bottleneck. There is no bottleneck. The data indicate a stably growing population from roughly the 13th century right through to European contact. The catastrophic decline on Rapa Nui happens after contact, driven by introduced disease and by Peruvian slave raids in the 1860s that removed a substantial fraction of the surviving population. Diamond has disputed the interpretation and the argument is not formally over. But the direction of the evidence is clear, and I think it is worth saying plainly. The single most famous example of a civilization destroying itself through short-sighted resource use appears to be a story about a civilization that survived difficult conditions for 500 years and was then destroyed by somebody else. I am telling you this for a specific reason. The ecocide narrative is emotionally satisfying because it makes collapse a moral failure, and moral failures are avoidable. If they destroyed themselves through stupidity and greed, then we can avoid it by not being stupid and greedy. That is the comfortable version, and the comfortable version has been failing peer review. What the actual cases show is much harder to metabolize. Rome, Pylos and Copan were not run by fools. They were run by capable administrators making locally correct decisions in institutions that had no mechanism for perceiving the quantity that was killing them. There was nothing to notice, in the sense of a thing a reasonable person would have flagged. There was only a slope. Which brings us to the fourth measurement, and to the part of this where I have to tell you that we have been running the same diagnostic on ourselves, in public, for over 50 years. Start with something concrete and physical, because the abstractions come later and I want the ground under them first. In March of 2025, the American Society of Civil Engineers published its infrastructure report card, which it has produced at 4-year intervals since 1998. The headline was positive. The overall grade came in at a C, the highest in the history of the exercise, up from a C- 4 years earlier, driven largely by the spending authorised under the 2021 infrastructure legislation. Read the rest of the document, and the headline curdles. The same report estimates that bringing American infrastructure to a state of good repair over the decade from 2024 to 2033 requires roughly $9.1 trillion, and that on current trajectories about 5.4 trillion of that will actually be funded. The gap is $3.7 trillion. 4 years earlier, the equivalent gap was 2.59 trillion. The grade went up, and the shortfall went up by more than $1 trillion at the same time. That is not a contradiction. That is what it looks like when the cost of maintaining an existing system is rising faster than the resources being allocated to it, and the two numbers are describing different things. One is describing condition. The other is describing the slope. Note the shape of that. This is a wealthy country at peak measured output, with functioning institutions and enormous technical capacity, unable to keep up with the maintenance of infrastructure it already built. Not build new things. Maintain the things that exist. The road network, the water mains, the bridges, the levees, the transit systems, the electrical grid, all of it constructed largely between the 1930s and the 1970s by a society with a small fraction of the current gross domestic product. That is the definition of the far side of a complexity curve. The accumulated stock requires more upkeep than the system generates surplus to provide, so the deficit gets carried forward as deferred maintenance, which is a debt denominated in physical decay rather than currency, and which compounds. And before anyone reaches for the obvious objection, this is not an American pathology. It is worse documented in America, because America documents everything, but the same condition is present across the wealthy world in more or less the same form. Germany, the country whose entire national self-image runs on engineering competence, has spent the last several years discovering that a substantial portion of its motorway bridges are structurally deficient, and that its rail network, once the reference standard for European punctuality, has degraded to the point where Swiss railways began restricting German trains from entering the Swiss network on time-sensitive routes because the delays were propagating into their own timetables. The German rail operators' own punctuality figures for long-distance services have run at levels that would have been a national scandal in 1990. The maintenance backlog on the network runs into tens of billions of euros and has been accumulating since reunification. Britain has the same story wearing different clothes, most visibly in a high-speed rail project that was authorised as a national spine, escalated in cost repeatedly, and was then cut back to a fraction of its original scope, while retaining a substantial fraction of its original cost. Japan, with the best-maintained infrastructure in the developed world, has been publishing increasingly urgent official assessments about the aging of structures built during its own post-war boom, because concrete built in the 1960s reaches the end of its design life in the 2020s, regardless of how well anyone has looked after it. Every one of those countries has different politics, different institutions, different labour law, different levels of corruption, different attitudes to public spending, and different funding mechanisms. If the cause were institutional, you would expect the outcomes to diverge according to the institutions. They do not diverge much. They converge, which is what you would expect if the driver were something structural that all of them share, which is a large accumulated stock of complexity built during a period of high energy surplus and high productivity growth, now being maintained during a period of neither. Now the second measurement, which is worse, because it is not about money available, it is about what money buys. The Transit Costs Project at New York University's Marin Institute, run by Eric Goldwyn and Alon Levy and their colleagues, assembled a database of construction costs for more than 900 rail projects across roughly 60 countries in order to answer a question nobody had systematically asked. Why does the same physical object cost wildly different amounts in different places? New York came out as the single most expensive place in the world to build subway. Phase 1 of the 2nd Avenue subway opened in 2017 at approximately $4.5 billion for 1.8 miles. Phase 2 is currently projected at around 7.7 billion for a comparable distance, which works out to something in the region of $4 billion per mile. For comparison, their international figures put Paris in the region of $160 million per mile and Madrid around $320 million, with a rough global average somewhere near $350 million. Los Angeles, the most expensive American project outside New York, runs around $800 million. So the ratio between New York and a competent European builder is not 20%. It is not double. It is somewhere between 8 and 12 times for the same engineering, using the same tunnel boring machines, frequently built by the same multinational contractors. Nobody thinks New York's subway tunnels are 8 times better. The same pattern shows up wherever you look at large physical projects in high-income countries. The Vokal nuclear expansion in Georgia, the first new American reactors in a generation, was estimated at roughly $14 billion in 2008 and finished somewhere between 30 and 37 billion, depending on what you count, 7 years behind schedule. The figure is genuinely disputed, and how you treat financing costs and the Westinghouse bankruptcy changes the answer by billions, which is itself a small demonstration of the problem. California's high-speed rail project was authorized by voters in 2008 at a stated cost around $33 billion and is now north of $100 billion with a much reduced scope. There is a paper by Lovering, Yip and Nordhaus, published in Energy Policy in 2016, that assembled construction cost data on 349 reactors, about 58% of everything ever built. Their finding for the United States was that reactors begun after the 3 Mile Island accident had median overnight construction costs roughly 2.8 times higher than those begun before, with build times more than doubled. That paper was contested immediately, notably by Kumi and Holtman, who argued the analysis obscured real cost trends. Both things can be true. The escalation is real, and the exact multiple is arguable. What is not arguable is the direction. We are worse at building physical infrastructure than we were 50 years ago, in real terms, per unit delivered, despite better machines, better materials, better software, better modelling, and better understanding of the underlying engineering. Take a second to appreciate how strange that is. Essentially every technical input to the process improved. The output per dollar got worse anyway. The reason is complexity, and it is complexity of the exact kind Tainter described. Environmental review that runs to thousands of pages and multiple years. Community consultation processes with veto points. Litigation risk that must be insured against. Procurement rules designed to prevent corruption, which do prevent some corruption, and which also make it impossible to simply hire the competent firm. Utility coordination. Historic preservation review. Safety regimes layered on safety regimes. Consultant layers hired because the public agency lost the in-house capacity to design things itself, which happened because it stopped building things, which happened because building became too expensive. Every one of those was added for a real reason, usually a good one, usually in response to a genuine abuse. Nobody invented environmental review for fun. Nobody added procurement rules out of malice. Each layer solved a problem. And the accumulated stack now costs more than the thing it regulates. That is not an ideological statement, or at least it does not have to be. You can be entirely in favour of every individual regulation and still recognise that the aggregate has a cost curve, and that the cost curve has a shape, and that the shape has a turn in it. Let us try to quantify the stack, since that is what this whole exercise is about. The Code of Federal Regulations, the compiled body of American federal rules, ran to fewer than 10,000 pages in 1950. By 2019, it was just under 186,000 pages. Over roughly the same window, staffing at federal regulatory agencies went from around 57,000 to around 277,000, and the inflation-adjusted budget for those agencies went from around $3 billion to around $58 billion. Page counts are a crude measure, so a project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, led by Patrick McLaughlin, built a better one. They machine-passed the entire corpus and counted binding restrictions, meaning occurrences of the specific words that create obligations: shall, must, may not. Required prohibited, that count went from roughly 406,000 in 1970 to about 1.09 million by 2018. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of number that gets weaponized. There is a widely cited estimate from a 2013 paper by Dawson and Seta that accumulated federal regulation reduced American growth by around 2 percentage points annually since 1949, implying something like $38 trillion of foregone output by 2011. That figure gets quoted constantly by people with an obvious interest in quoting it, and the methodology has been heavily criticized, and I would not put weight on it. The counting of restrictions is solid empirical work. The economy-wide drag estimate is a modelling exercise with enormous error bars. But you do not need the disputed number. The undisputed number is sufficient, and here it is. The stock of binding federal restrictions has roughly tripled in 50 years, and there is no mechanism anywhere in the system for removing them at a comparable rate. Regulations accumulate. They are added by every administration of every political persuasion, and the occasional deregulatory push removes a tiny fraction of the stock while adding new rules elsewhere. The structure is a ratchet. It only turns one way. That is not a political observation about which rules are good. It is a structural observation about the shape of the system, and the shape is that complexity in this domain can only increase, which means the cost of compliance can only increase, which means the return on the next unit of it can only fall. And the same ratchet is running in every large institution we have. American healthcare spends more per person than any other system on Earth, and a paper by Himmelstein, Campbell and Woolhandler published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in January of 2020 put the administrative share of that spending at 34.2% for the year 2017. $812 billion, roughly $2,500 per person per year, spent not on care but on the machinery of determining who pays for care. Their comparison figure for Canada was 17%, and their earlier work had the American figure around 31% at the end of the 1990s, so the direction is upward. You have probably seen a chart claiming that the number of healthcare administrators in the United States grew by around 3,200% between 1970 and 2010, while the number of physicians grew by around 150%. That chart is derived from this same research group's work, extended by others, and the later portion of it is extrapolated rather than measured, so I would not lean on the specific figure. A cleaner number from the Bureau of Labour Statistics has healthcare administrators going from roughly 118,000 in 1970 to over 600,000 today, which is a 5-fold increase against a much slower increase in clinicians. Same shape in universities, where administrative staff have grown substantially faster than faculty across 4 decades of federal education data. Same shape in the military, in the ratio between combat personnel and support structure. Same shape, honestly, in almost every organisation above a certain size that any of us have worked in, which is why this material tends to produce a particular flicker of recognition in people who have spent time inside a large institution. You know what it feels like when the number of people whose job is to coordinate the work exceeds the number of people doing the work. Everyone who has been in a large company knows exactly what that feels like. That feeling is not a mood. It is a measurement, and it is the same measurement Lactantius was making about Diocletian's empire in 316 AD when he complained that the tax collectors outnumbered the taxpayers. The identical observation, 1700 years apart, from a Christian polemicist and from a health policy paper in a peer-reviewed medical journal. Tainter saw this coming, incidentally, and he wrote about it in 1988, which was before most of the data I have just given you existed. The final section of his book turns from archaeology to the present, and it is the part that made a number of his academic reviewers uncomfortable, some of whom described it as the weakest chapter. He argued that the same curve was visible in contemporary industrial societies, and he pointed at three things specifically. Medicine, where each additional dollar of health spending was buying smaller increments of life expectancy than the dollar before it. Education, where the relationship between spending per student and measurable outcomes had flattened. And research, where he drew on earlier work by the historian of science Derek de Solla Price, showing that scientific output per scientist had been declining for decades. He also used an example from Cyril Northcote Parkinson, the man who gave us Parkinson's Law, who had documented something peculiar about the British Admiralty. Between 1914 and 1928, the number of capital ships in the Royal Navy fell by about 67%. The number of officers and men fell by about 31%, and the number of dockyard workers fell as well. Over the same period, the number of Admiralty officials administering all of it rose by roughly 78%. Parkinson observed dryly that this constituted a magnificent navy on land. The joke is nearly a century old. The Admiralty was not corrupt, and the officials were not idle. They were administering an increasingly complicated set of relationships, technologies, and procedures, each of which had a justification. And the aggregate was an organisation whose administrative mass grew as its operational capacity shrank. Tainter's critics were right that his contemporary chapter was thinner than his archaeology. He had intuition and scattered evidence and no rigorous quantification, and he was extrapolating from a model built on ancient societies to a modern one with an energy base and an information technology that had no historical precedent. What has happened in the 38 years since is that the quantification arrived, not from him and not from anyone trying to prove him right, and mostly from researchers who I doubt have read him. It arrived from health economists and civil engineers and productivity statisticians doing their own work for their own reasons, and every one of those measurements landed on the curve he had drawn from potsherds. There is one more thing worth taking from him before we go further, and it comes with a name attached. Because Ugo Bardi, a physical chemist at the University of Florence, gave it one. Bardi calls it the Seneca effect, after a line from the Roman Stoic Seneca the Younger, writing in the 1st century AD, to the effect that the road to growth is long and slow, while the road to ruin is rapid. Bardi's argument, developed in a book published by Springer in 2017, is that decline in complex systems is not symmetrical with growth. The ascent is gradual because it is built by accumulation. The descent is faster because the accumulated structure is interdependent, and interdependent structures fail in cascades rather than in sequence. Which means the fact that nothing has visibly happened for 50 years on the wrong side of the curve is not reassuring. It is what the model predicts. The long quiet slope and the rapid descent are the same curve. But administrative bloat and construction costs are the visible layer, and I would not have made this if that were all there was. Because those are politically legible problems that everybody already argues about. The next measurement is not politically legible at all, and it is the one that genuinely changed how I think about this. Because it says the problem is not in our institutions, it is in our ideas. In 2020, 4 economists published a paper in the American Economic Review with a title that reads like a shrug and a finding that does not. Nicholas Bloom of Stanford, Charles Jones of Stanford, John Van Reenen of MIT, and Michael Webb. The paper is called "Are Ideas Getting Harder to Find?" The answer is yes, and they quantified it. Their method is to take specific, well-documented technological trajectories and measure two things over time: how much progress is being made and how much research input it takes to make it. Not spending in dollars, which is confounded by inflation and by what researchers cost. Effective researcher numbers. The flagship case is Moore's Law, the doubling of transistor density on integrated circuits roughly every 2 years, which has held for half a century and is the most reliable technological trend in modern history. Progress has been steady. So the question is, what it costs to keep it steady. Their finding is that the number of researchers required to sustain that same constant rate of doubling is now more than 18 times larger than it was in the early 1970s. 18 times the people for the same rate of improvement. They ran the same analysis on agricultural yields for corn, soybeans, cotton, and wheat. Same shape. They ran it on medical research and mortality improvements for specific cancers and for heart disease. Same shape. They ran it across the aggregate American economy. Same shape. Their headline estimate is that research productivity, meaning ideas produced per unit of research effort, is falling at approximately 5.1% per year. 5% a year, compounding, means research productivity halves roughly every 14 years. Now put that beside the fact that total research output is at an all-time high. More scientists are alive right now than in all previous history combined. More papers are published every year than ever before. More money is spent on research and development, in real terms, than at any point in human civilization. Every headline number is at maximum, and the return per unit of effort is falling by 5% a year. That is the curve. That is exactly, precisely, quantitatively the curve. Total output at all-time maximum, marginal return in sustained decline, measured by mainstream economists at elite institutions, published in the flagship journal of the profession, and treated as an interesting puzzle in the growth literature rather than as what it structurally is. And there is a second, independent measurement that agrees. In January of 2023, Michael Park, Erin Leahy, and Russell Funk published a paper in Nature that analysed 45 million scientific papers and 3.9 million patents using a metric called the CD index, which measures whether a piece of work consolidates an existing field or disrupts it. A disruptive paper is one that renders its own predecessors obsolete, so that subsequent researchers cite it instead of the work it built on. A consolidating paper is one that gets cited alongside its predecessors as an incremental addition. Their finding is that average disruptiveness has fallen by more than 90% for papers between 1945 and 2010, and by more than 78% for patents between 1980 and 2010, and it falls in every field they examined: life sciences, physical sciences, technology, social sciences, all of them over the same period. I should tell you that this one is contested. A 2024 analysis by Peterson and colleagues in quantitative science studies argues the CD index is biased by citation inflation, meaning that the sheer growth in the number of papers and the number of references in each paper mechanically depresses the metric. That is a serious critique, and it may be right. But notice something. The Bloom paper and the Park paper use completely different data, completely different methods, and completely different definitions, and they arrive at the same conclusion from opposite directions. And there is a third from an entirely different field that nobody disputes at all. The pharmaceutical industry has a name for it. Erum's Law, That is more spelled backward, and the joke is the entire argument. In 2012, Jack Scannell and colleagues published an analysis in Nature Review's Drug Discovery showing that the number of new drugs approved per $1 billion of research and development spending, inflation adjusted, has halved roughly every 9 years since 1950. Consistently, through the discovery of the structure of NAR, through the invention of recombinant technology, through combinatorial chemistry, through high-throughput screening, through the sequencing of the human genome, through the entire computational revolution in biology. Every single one of those was supposed to fix it. The genome in particular was going to transform drug discovery. Each new technique produces a brief bump, and then the line resumes its descent at the same slope it has had since the Truman administration. Sit with that. We are spending exponentially more to get linearly less in the single most commercially motivated research enterprise in human history, where the financial incentive to reverse the trend is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. And it has been declining smoothly for 70 years through every technological revolution we have had. That is not an institutional failure. You cannot fix that with better management. The pharmaceutical industry has tried literally everything, including firing everyone and starting again, repeatedly. That is what a marginal return curve looks like when it is measured properly. And then there is the aggregate, which is the number that ties it all together. Total factor productivity. That is the residual, the portion of economic growth that is not explained by adding more labour or more capital. It is the closest thing economics has to a measure of how much better we are getting at converting inputs into outputs, which is to say, it is the closest available proxy for the marginal return on complexity for an entire society. Robert Gordon's 2016 book on American growth is the definitive treatment, and his argument, compressed, is that the period from roughly 1870 to 1970 was an anomaly. That century contained electrification, the internal combustion engine, indoor plumbing, chemical fertilizer, antibiotics, the telephone, refrigeration, and the aircraft, and those things are not repeatable, because you can only add running water to a house once. American total factor productivity growth in the middle decades of the 20th century runs at rates we have not seen since. It slows sharply after 1970, picks up modestly with computing in the late 1990s, and then slows again after 2005 through the entire smartphone era, through the entire era of the modern internet. Gordon's critics say he is underestimating unmeasured quality improvements, and there is a real debate there. But no serious participant in that debate argues that measured productivity growth in the rich world is not substantially below its mid-century rate. They argue about why, and about whether the statistics capture everything. The slope is not in dispute. And now the physical layer underneath all of it, which is where this stops being an economics argument and becomes a thermodynamic one. Charles Hall, an ecologist at the State University of New York, developed a metric in the 1970s called energy return on investment. It asks a simple question about any energy source. How much energy do you get out, divided by how much energy you had to spend to get it? In the 1930s, American oil ran at somewhere around 100 to 1. You drilled a shallow well into pressurized reservoirs where the oil came up under its own force, and for every barrel of energy you spent on the operation, you got roughly 100 back. That number is the reason the 20th century happened. 99% of the energy obtained was surplus, available for everything else. Cities, universities, aircraft, hospitals, symphony orchestras. The entire apparatus of a complex society is built out of energy surplus, and for a few decades in the middle of the last century, the surplus was the largest any human society had ever had access to by an enormous margin. Global oil today runs somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 to 1, depending on whose accounting you use and where you draw the boundary. The easy oil was used first, exactly as the model predicts, and what remains requires deeper drilling, offshore platforms, horizontal wells, hydraulic fracturing, steam injection into tar sands, and continuous redrilling of wells that deplete rapidly. Holes further claim, and I want to flag that this part is much softer than the measurement itself, is that there is a minimum energy return required to sustain a given level of civilizational complexity. His rough scaling runs roughly like this, around 3 to 1 at the wellhead just to run the truck that moves the fuel, around 5 to 1 to also grow and transport the food. Higher still to support families and education, something in the region of 12 to 14 to 1 to support the full apparatus of a modern society, including healthcare and the arts. He is explicit that these are approximate, and the threshold is debated by people who know the field better than I do, but it does not really matter whether the number is 11 or 14 or 8. What matters is that this is the same curve again, in the most fundamental units available, joules in and joules out, with no institutions or ideologies or policies involved at all. The cheap energy was used first. It cannot be used again. Each subsequent unit costs more energy to obtain, which means the surplus that pays for complexity is contracting while the complexity that requires the surplus is expanding. I have now given you 5 independent measurements. Infrastructure maintenance deficit, construction cost per unit delivered, administrative share of output, research productivity per researcher, energy return on energy invested, 5 different disciplines, 5 different methodologies, 5 different sets of researchers who mostly do not read each other's journals, and 5 curves with the same shape and the same sign change, all clustering the turn somewhere between the late 1960s and the early 1980s. And there is a 6th thing, which is the tin. We looked at the Bronze Age, and I told you the structural vulnerability was a single critical input concentrated in a few remote locations, with no domestic substitute, on which the entire technological base depended. Advanced semiconductors are manufactured overwhelmingly in Taiwan. I want to be careful with this number because the commonly quoted figure of over 90% is contested. The process analyst Scott and Jones has argued publicly that the 90% figure is substantially inflated when you look at total advanced silicon capacity rather than leading-edge logic specifically, and puts the relevant share closer to 2/3. TSMC's own reporting shows advanced nodes at 7 nanometers and below making up around 70% or more of its wafer revenue in recent years. So the honest statement is that one company, on one island, in one seismically active strait, manufactures a majority and possibly a large majority of the world's most advanced logic chips, and there is no substitute that can be brought online in less than several years at a cost of tens of billions of dollars per facility. Rare earth elements are worse and less disputed. China accounts for roughly 60% of global mining of rare earths and, according to International Energy Agency figures cited by analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, approximately 90% of the world's processing and refining capacity. For some specific inputs, the concentration is higher still. China supplied something like 98% of the world's unprocessed gallium as of 2022. That is the structure. A globally interdependent technological civilization whose most critical material inputs are geographically concentrated in a small number of choke points, with no meaningful domestic redundancy, because redundancy is expensive and the efficient thing to do was to consolidate. The Bronze Age states did the identical thing for the identical reason. They did not build strategic tin reserves either. Buffers are always the first thing optimized away, because a buffer is by definition capacity that is not producing anything, and in a competitive environment the actor who maintains buffers is outcompeted by the actor who does not, right up until the moment the buffers would have mattered. None of this is a prediction. I want to be clear about that, because this material attracts prediction, and prediction is where it goes wrong. Nobody can tell you when, or whether, or how. Tainter himself is careful about this, and he has been asked repeatedly in interviews where he thinks we are on the curve, and he generally declines to give a date. There is one attempt at a formal answer worth mentioning. In 2021, Guy Harrington published a paper in the Journal of Industrial Ecology comparing empirical data from the last 50 years against the scenarios generated by the World 3 model, the computer simulation behind the 1972 Limits to Growth report. That report was mocked for decades, frequently by people who had not read it, largely because of predictions it did not actually make. Harrington's finding was that current data track most closely to two of the model's scenarios, one of which involves industrial output and welfare peaking around 2030 and declining thereafter. Her own framing is careful, and she stresses this is not a forecast of extinction or catastrophe, but a halt to growth. And separately, Peter Turchin, working from an entirely different tradition, published a piece in Nature in 2010 arguing on structural demographic grounds that the 2020s would be a period of rising instability in the United States and Western Europe, driven by stagnating popular living standards and by what he calls elite overproduction, meaning more people credentialed and positioned for elite roles than there are elite roles available. He and Korotayev published a retrospective assessment in 2020 concluding the prediction had held up on the specific indicators he had named. You are welcome to be skeptical of both of those. I am, somewhat, about the modelling in particular. Long-range socio-economic modelling has a poor track record and everyone in the field knows it. But that is not really the point, and if you take one thing from this, it should be this. The forecasts are the weakest part of the argument, and they are also the only part anyone ever argues about. The measurements are the strong part, and the measurements are not forecasts. They are descriptions of what has already happened to 5 decimal places in the past tense. The infrastructure deficit is not a projection, it is an accounting of work not done. The research productivity decline is not a model, it is a count of researchers and outputs that already exist. The energy return figures are not scenarios. They are what it costs, today, in joules, to obtain a joule. Every civilization in this story crossed while holding a number that described the crossing, and in every case the number was in the past tense too. There is one more piece to this, and it is the part I did not expect when I started reading, and it is the reason I could not leave the subject alone. There is a signal. Not a forecast, an actual, physical, measurable early warning signature that appears in complex systems before they undergo a critical transition, and it appears reliably enough that it has been detected retroactively in ice cores, in lake sediments, in laboratory populations, and in financial time series. The foundational paper is by Martin Scheffer and colleagues, published in Nature in 2009, titled Early Warning Signals for Critical Transitions. Scheffer is an ecologist at Wageningen in the Netherlands, who spent his career studying why shallow lakes flip suddenly from clear water to algal murk, and why coral reefs flip to algae, and why those flips are so hard to reverse once they happen. The underlying phenomenon is called critical slowing down, and it comes out of dynamical systems theory rather than ecology, which is why it generalizes. Here is the mechanism. Any stable system, when you push it, returns to its resting state at some characteristic rate. Push a pendulum, it swings back. Push a lake ecosystem with a nutrient pulse, it recovers over some number of weeks. Push an economy with a shock, it returns to trend over some number of quarters. That recovery rate is a property of how deep the stability well is, how strongly the system is held in its current configuration. As a system approaches a tipping point, the well gets shallower. The system is still in it. From the outside, the system looks the same. It is still clear water, still a functioning reef, still a stable economy. But the restoring force weakens, and the recovery rate slows. Which produces two things you can actually measure in ordinary time series data, without knowing anything about the underlying mechanism. The first is rising variance. If the system takes longer to return to baseline after each perturbation, the fluctuations get larger because each new disturbance arrives before the previous one has fully damped out. The system starts wobbling more. The second is rising autocorrelation. Each state becomes more similar to the state immediately before it, because the system is no longer snapping back, it is drifting. Statistically, the memory of the system lengthens. Larger swings and slower recovery from them. That is the signature. And the remarkable thing is that it has been found where it should be. Vasilis Dakos and colleagues published work in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2008 examining paleoclimate records from 8 documented abrupt climate transitions in Earth's history, including the end of the last glacial period, and found rising autocorrelation preceding all of them. Stephen Carpenter and William Brock demonstrated rising variance before regime shifts in lake systems. Lady and colleagues published experimental work in Science in 2012 in which they grew yeast populations in the laboratory, deliberately degraded their environment toward a known collapse threshold, and watched the early warning indicators rise before the population crashed, exactly as theory predicted. It works. Under controlled conditions where you know the answer in advance, the signal is there and it is detectable before the transition. So the obvious question, the one I sat with for a long time, is whether anyone is running this on us. The answer is that people have tried, in patches. There is research applying these methods to financial markets, to specific ecosystems, to epidemiological data, to some measures of political polarization. There are individual papers. What does not exist, anywhere, is a systematic, funded, continuously updated monitoring apparatus for the resilience indicators of the civilization we all live inside. We monitor the level. Obsessively, there is a global apparatus of enormous sophistication measuring output, employment, prices, trade flows, sentiment, updated monthly, quarterly, in some cases by the second, with entire industries built around interpreting it. We do not monitor the depth of the well, and I want to be fair about why, because it is not stupidity and it is not suppression. The methods are genuinely hard to apply to social systems. You need long, clean, stationary time series, and social data is short, noisy, and full of definitional changes. You need to know what variable to watch, and in a system with millions of coupled variables that is not obvious. There are real papers arguing these indicators produce false positives in complex settings. The technical objections are legitimate, but notice what the technical objections do not say. They do not say the phenomenon is not real. They say it is hard to measure in our case specifically. So we have a well-established physical signature that precedes critical transitions in complex systems. We have confirmed it experimentally. We have found it retroactively in past transitions. We have decided it is too difficult to apply to the one system whose transition would affect every human being alive, and we have therefore continued to monitor exclusively the quantity that we know from. 4,000 years of archaeological evidence stays at maximum right up until the end. That is the situation, not a cover-up, a budget line that does not exist. And I keep thinking about the fact that a lake ecosystem gets better resilience monitoring than a civilization does, because a lake is tractable. Now let me tell you why none of this feels like anything, because that is the final piece, and it is the oldest one. In 1995, a fisheries scientist named Daniel Pauly published a one-page note in Trends in Ecology and Evolution describing a problem he had noticed in his own field. Each generation of fisheries scientists, he observed, takes the stock levels that existed at the start of their own career as the baseline against which to measure change. They then measure declines from that baseline correctly, and the next generation does the same, starting from the already depleted state their predecessors ended with. The result is that the accumulated decline across generations disappears entirely. Every individual scientist is measuring accurately. The aggregate measurement is wrong by an enormous margin, and the error is invisible from inside any single career. He called it shifting baseline syndrome, and it is not a fisheries problem. It is a property of how human cognition handles slow change, and it applies to everything. You calibrate normal from your own experience. You cannot do otherwise. The world you grew up in is the world, and everything after is variation. Somebody born in 1990 experiences the current cost of building a mile of subway as simply what it costs, not as a 12-fold anomaly. It has always cost that, within their lifetime, and their lifetime is the entire available sample. This is why the boiling frog metaphor persists even though it is factually false. A real frog jumps out. The metaphor survives because it describes something true about us that we do not have a better word for. We detect events. We are superb at it. A branch snaps behind you and your entire nervous system reorganizes in under 200 milliseconds. That is 100 million years of predator avoidance, and it works beautifully. We do not detect slopes. There is no organ for it. There is no sensation associated with a second derivative, and every case in this story is a second derivative. Rutilius Nematianus, sailing past the ruins in 417 and writing that Rome grows from its misfortunes, was not deceiving himself. He was correctly reporting his experience. He had lived through the sack of Rome and the empire had continued, taxes were still collected, the Senate still met, ships still sailed, his own villa still stood in Gaul. Every event he could point to had been survived. The evidence available to him supported his conclusion. His conclusion was wrong because the relevant quantity was not an event, and it was not available to him in a form he could perceive. Sidonius Apollinaris, writing elegant verse to his friends while Gaul dissolved, was not fiddling while Rome burned. He was living his life, in the world as he had always known it, which continued to contain dinner parties and poetry and letters from friends, right up until it did not, and even then continued to contain them in reduced form under different management. And the Pylos accountant filing the furniture inventory was doing his job competently on an ordinary day at work in a functioning institution, with no information available to him that anything was different about this particular week. That is the state I am describing. Not denial, not complacency. Correct local perception, accurate reporting, sound reasoning, applied to the wrong variable by people who had no access to the right one and no category for what it would have meant, which is where this lands, and I want to put it as precisely as I can. The point of no return is not an upcoming event you can prepare for. It is not a threshold you will be warned about. It is a ratio, and the ratio has already flipped in at least 5 independently measured domains, and the crossing dates cluster in a period that ended before most people watching this were born. That is not a prophecy. That is a description of published data, and every individual measurement in it is uncontroversial within its own field. The infrastructure deficit is an engineering accounting. The construction cost ratios are a database of 900 projects. The research productivity decline is in the American Economic Review. Erum's law has held for 70 years. The energy return figures are arithmetic. What is contested is what they mean together, and the reason that is contested is that nobody owns the question. There is no discipline whose job it is to look at all 5 at once. The economists have the productivity numbers, the engineers have the infrastructure numbers, the ecologists have the energy numbers, the archaeologists have the historical pattern, and each of them is looking at a curve in their own field and describing it as a puzzle specific to their field. Tainter's whole contribution was to notice that they are the same curve, and the response to that observation, since 1988, has been to cite it. The book is enormously cited and almost entirely unactioned, and those two facts are not in tension. They are the same fact. There is nothing obvious to do with the observation, because the observation does not identify a villain, does not suggest a policy, does not fit inside an electoral cycle, and does not point at anything that could be repaired by any actor who currently exists. You cannot unratchet a regulatory code, you cannot recover the shallow oil, you cannot make the easy ideas undiscovered so someone can find them again. The cheap solutions were used first. That is the whole mechanism, and it is not reversible by intent. So here is what the far side of the curve actually looks like, since we are standing on it. It looks like this. Exactly like this. It looks like everything working, most of the time slightly worse and slightly more expensively than it used to, with each individual degradation explicable by local causes that are genuinely the local causes. The bridge that closes is closed because of a specific funding dispute in a specific county. The project that takes 11 years takes 11 years because of a specific lawsuit. The drug that costs $2 billion to develop costs that because of specific trial requirements. None of those explanations are wrong. All of them are correct. And the aggregate of 10,000 correct local explanations is a slope that no local explanation contains. That is why nobody will ever announce it. There is nothing to announce. There is no day on which the ratio crosses 0 and a bell rings. There was no such day in Rome, no such day at Pylos, no such day at Copan, and the entire archaeological record of the human species contains not one single example of a society that identified its own crossing while standing on it. Not one. In 4,000 years of records across every continent. With every level of literacy and mathematical sophistication, including societies that were tracking the relevant number continuously in their own administrative documents, the count of civilizations that recognized the crossing in real time is 0. And they were not less intelligent than you. That is the part I would like to insist on, because the comfortable move here is to assume they lacked something we have. They had the arithmetic. The Maya had a better calendar than medieval Europe. Roman engineers built aqueducts still standing today. The Bronze Age palaces ran multinational logistics on clay. What they lacked was not capability. It was a category. There was no available idea into which the observation could be placed, and so the observation, which was made continuously and accurately, was filed under procurement, or inflation, or an unusually expensive year for monument carving. We have the category now. Tainter published it 38 years ago. It is in print, in libraries, cited thousands of times. And the 5 measurements sit in 5 separate literatures, being described by careful and honest researchers as puzzles specific to their own fields. I said earlier that I would come back to what our instruments are actually reading, and here it is. Every headline number our civilization uses to assess itself is a total. Gross output. Total employment. Total research spending. Number of scientists. Terawatt hours generated. Miles of road. And every one of those totals goes up on both sides of the crossing. because the total is driven by the accumulated stock of complexity, and the stock keeps growing long after the return on new additions has gone negative. That is not a flaw in the statistics. The statistics are correct. They are measuring exactly what they claim to measure. They are simply measuring the quantity that is highest at the moment of greatest danger. Which means that as the underlying ratio degrades further, the visible indicators will continue to look reasonable and possibly excellent, and will continue to be reported accurately by honest people. And every generation will calibrate its sense of normal from the world it inherits, and the aggregate slope will remain invisible in the only place it would need to be visible, which is in somebody's felt sense that something is wrong. You are not going to feel it. That is the thing. You are going to live your entire life on this curve, and it is going to feel like life. I want to go back to the tablet. The scribe at Pylos, in the last year of the palace, sitting in a room off the Megaron with a stack of wet clay. He records the assignment of rowers to the coastal stations. He records the collection of bronze from the sanctuaries in the 16 districts. He records the furniture, the tripods and the tables with ivory inlay. Itemized for the archive because a new governor has been appointed and the inventory has to be correct. He is good at his job. The hand is neat. The accounts balance. When he finishes the day's tablets, he puts them in a basket in the archive room, where they will sit until the end of the accounting year, at which point they will be soaked and pulped and made into fresh clay, the way they have been every year for as long as anyone in the building can remember. They were never soaked. The fire came first, and the fire is the only reason any of it survived. Every word we have from that world was preserved by the event that ended it. If Pylos had continued for another decade, that basket would have been recycled into blank slabs, and we would know nothing about the last year, because the last year was a year like the others, and nobody keeps a record of an ordinary year. The record exists because the fire came. The fire is the reason we can read the last normal day. And nothing on the tablet says so. Nothing on any of them says so. There is no annotation, no marginal note, no change in the hand. A functioning bureaucracy, doing its work correctly, in a world that had already ended and had not been informed. The crossing was decades behind him. He would not have believed you. He would have shown you the inventory.